I'm Tom Field. I'm Senior Vice President of Editorial with Information Security Media Group. I'm talking today about third party risk management, ESG, risk quantification, what CISOs need to know for 2023. I am delighted to be speaking with Richard Marcus. He's VP Information Security with Audit Board. Richard, thanks so much for taking time to speak with me today.
Hey, Tom, thanks for having me.
So I threw a lot of topics at you up front: third-party risk management, environmental, social, and governance risk, risk quantification. Why are all these topics critically important as we enter a new year?
I think risk quantification is important just because we see risk velocity increasing. I think as information security professionals, we're constantly stretched to worry about a broader scope of assets, more data, more people. The emerging risk landscape is just accelerating faster than we can keep our arms around. And so risk quantification is something that's really important to make sure that you're identifying, categorizing, and prioritizing risks so that you can spend your sort of limited investment and really in the smartest way possible to control that risk. Same story on the third-party risk management side. I think as the sort of digital transformation has resulted in the decentralization of our data, we're called to use more and more third parties to do our important work. And so you've got more and more risk sitting outside of the organization that has to be assessed and measured as well. And ESG has just become a really popular sort of emerging theme that we're seeing across our customer base. It's a cultural phenomenon as well as a regulatory phenomenon. There's a call for more transparency, more accountability for what you do and how you do it as an organization. Certainly it impacts environmental and social topics. It also starting to creep into the security and privacy world as well. People just want to know more about what you're doing as a business to secure your customer data and privacy.
Well, boy, as you describe it, there's so much happening on so many different planes today for every organization. How does one determine which risks, which threats are the top ones to their organization or to their sector?
I think it starts at the top with a really well thought out risk and threat assessment. That's where you really seek to work with the business to understand their objectives, what kinds of scenarios can impact your ability to deliver against those objectives, and then start to think a little bit more thoughtfully about how those threats might manifest and what key controls need in place to prevent that from occurring. So it's really specific at an organization by organization level, but it's about bringing the people together to discover those risks and come up with a plan to address them.
Your perspective, what are your top risk priorities as we go into 2023?
Well, I'm in the enterprise SaaS business, so I'm really focused about software and the needs of my customers. As we talked about at the top of our chat today, third-party risk is certainly top of mind for us, and more specifically, software supply chain. I think like any software, it's going to be made up of components. Some of them are first party, some of them are third party. So can you really speak to the security and integrity of those components and how the software is built? So third-party supply chain, software supply chain, those are really big for us, as I think they are for most folks. We're starting to see supply chain incidents and threats manifest more and more. You're hearing about them in the news. So we know lots of our competitors and different folks are kind of worried about the same kinds of topics. I think for us also, because we're in a service business, insider threat is also a pretty high on our minds. We've seen a couple of high-profile breaches this past year, and a couple of different companies in our space get hit with insider threat, not just from malicious and privileged insiders, but also from employees that might be falling victim to social engineering, compromised employees, and the use of their credentials being used to get you from the inside. I think as we've focused a lot as an industry over the last couple of years, shoring up infrastructure security and application security, we've really hardened the front door. And we're finding that more and more attackers are looking for that side door or that back door to get what they're after. And so we're thinking a lot about what are those sort of secondary entry points that we need to be shoring up, and really that sort of lands with securing the user, the employee, the subcontractor, the supply chain folks that might be able to introduce some of that risk that is not really the first thing that you're always thinking about.
Well, you've given us so much to think about, lots of areas for follow-up. Let's start here. Risk assessment. Who should be involved in the process today and why?
Well, I think, I mentioned that anybody that's got responsibility for the goals and objectives of your organization should probably be involved. The risk assessment really should start with risks to the business and their ability to execute those against those objectives. So the executive team, the board, if you get them involved and get their perspective on where the business is going and what they're trying to accomplish, that can be certainly very, very valuable. The folks in your organization that have P&L responsibility, they're going to have to be bought in, because they're going to have to fund and pay for the controls to secure against some of the risks and threats that you're detecting in your assessment. So they're certainly important as well. And then, of course, you need someone that's got tactical views into the threats that your organization faces. So, of course, IT, InfoSec. I think where a lot of organizations fall down in their assessment process is not pulling incident response very tightly or tightly enough into the process to provide that real world view of threats. A lot of times risk assessments can be hypothetical, a lot of what ifs, what's the likelihood and impact of something happening, but your practitioners in the trenches, they know what's actually occurring day to day in the business. And the more you can bring actual incident data into the process to show the rest of the participants that, these are not hypothetical things. These are things that are backed up by real data. These incidents have real impact. It can make the activity much more real for some of the executives that might be participating in the process. And I think the last little bit that's useful is bringing in industry data. If you have competitors or others in the industry that are facing these risks, it's another tool that you can use to leverage to just make these assessments more real, drive more meaningful assessment conversations, and produce realistic outcomes so that your business is really educated about what the risks are, in the world that they operate in.
So you talked about senior management and the board, and certainly security leaders are getting a lot more time with these individuals these days. And security leaders tell me they're having lots of conversations about risk appetite. What are some best practices for building rapport and then getting buy-in from senior management and the board?
I think a lot of it is timing. We intentionally schedule our risk assessment right before the end of year budget and planning cycle for the next year begins. So I know a lot of folks watching this interview are probably entering or hopefully sort of working through their 2023 plans right now. And it's really helpful to have those conversations together. You don't want investment asks to be coming in from left field without context. You really want those two things to be aligned. So we go through the assessment process. There's an educational aspect to it. They're learning about the risks and threats that their businesses face. And then they're followed up with an ask. And that investment is tied to hopefully key controls that are going to reduce or limit some of the risks and threats that were identified in that assessment. So it's helpful to connect the dots. We're not just a cost center. We're doing things to help the business go fast and unlock opportunities. And sometimes it's really just about telling the story right and connecting those dots and showing them we're not just doing this for security's sake. We're doing this to help the business achieve what it needs to in the next year.
Richard, we can't have this conversation without acknowledging the skills gap that impacts every organization. Given that gap, given the inability to be able to recruit and retain appropriately, how can one plan to better incorporate technology to help fill the gap?
Yeah, I think we mentioned it at the top of the call today that at the rate that risk is increasing, the velocity of risk is increasing. We're dealing with a lot more surface area, but not always with the more people or more budget. I think most people are seeing their teams shrink and budgets shrink over the next year. So, how do you do more with less is certainly the question. I think the key is to leverage platforms that allow you to work smarter. And really, the connected risk concept is about bringing people together and bringing data together in one platform. Automation is certainly a key part of that. But you want to avoid the duplication of efforts. You got a lot of teams across the organization, whether it's IT, InfoSec, risk, audit, compliance, all doing kind of similar kinds of work, generating the same kinds of work product. Maybe they're testing the same controls, collecting the same evidence. So getting those teams to work together in one platform, deduplicating efforts, reusing evidence, these are all great ways to add a little bit more bandwidth to your team if you're limited in resources. And then really getting your teams out of the manual work. So whether it's mapping controls, collecting evidence, continuous monitoring, reporting, these are all things that take a lot of human effort to do if you're doing them manually in spreadsheets or email. And the more you can automate and use technology to get people out of those processes, the more time you have to do the really meaningful work.
Related, how does one manage the increase in velocity of third parties, as you mentioned, given this gap in resources?
Yeah, the story is pretty similar there. I would say, it's about automating the manual efforts, whether that's detecting new third-party relationships and identifying those on the front end, categorizing them based on the nature of those relationships, and then the engagement, the day-to-day engagement with those vendors, whether it's scheduling questionnaires or automating the collection of evidence like your SOC 2 and compliance reports, and then really trying to integrate any findings that you have from that process into the broader enterprise risk register rather than treating it sort of as a one-off manual process. So again, it's about connecting people, connecting data to really make that process faster and easier.
Let's come back to this emerging topic of ESG. How are you thinking about ESG risk as it relates to vendors?
Well, ESG is really interesting because it means different things to different companies in different industries. Obviously, as an enterprise software company, we don't have the same ESG topics that we care about as we would if we were in the, oil and gas or energy industry, right? So every industry's got their different ESG topics that they care about. But I think what we're interested in knowing, because this is an emerging sort of trend, is for the vendors that we work with, do you have an ESG program? Can you explain it to us? Like, do you track ESG topics for your business and for your vendors? And can you report to us on how you're doing there? It speaks to a set of corporate ethics, and are these the kinds of companies that we want to do business with? I think certainly everyone cares about DEI initiatives and environmental programs. There's things that make you feel good about doing business with companies that are having a positive impact in the world. And we certainly want to measure and understand the levels of commitments in the vendors that we work with. But given this is a really emerging sort of given this is an emerging sort of trend in our industry, we really want to know which vendors are kind of taking this charge seriously versus the ones that aren't.
We've covered a lot in a short period of time here, Richard. As we sum up, how should security leaders be thinking differently today about third-party risk management, ESG risk, and risk quantification as we go into the new year?
Well, I would say if you sort of start to first think about third-party risk, ESG, and risk quantification in general, it may seem like a big challenge, and it certainly is. But it can also be a really big enabler for your business. Ultimately, all of these things are practices that if you do it right, they allow your business to go faster and farther and have a higher chance of success against your company objectives. Particularly in the enterprise SaaS space, like I'm in, companies don't want to do business with companies that are not ethical or not secure or not handling risk appropriately. So it absolutely is a business enabler, a revenue driver, and if you get it right, it's much more than a cost center. I think, given what we talked about in terms of the scarcity of resources, the battle for talent, the explosions of scale that we deal with, I think security leaders should really be thinking about how do they do this in a way that doesn't require them to just throw piles of money and people at the problem, but rather leverage technology in meaningful ways, connect your risks, connect your people, connect your data together so that you can solve this risk equation in a much more meaningful way, in a much more cost-effective way that actually reduces risk for your organization.
Well said. Richard, I appreciate your time and insight. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tom. Appreciate you having me.
Again, the topic has been risk. You've heard from Richard Marcus. He's VP Information Security with Audit Board for Information Security Media Group. I'm Tom Field. Thank you for giving us your time and attention today.